Most welcome back to lunch, from lunch. How was your lunch? How was your lunch? Could we kindly pull up and occupy seats that are nearer? Could we kindly do that quickly? For those who are seated at the back, please indulge me. Indulge me this afternoon. So as our dear participants who are seated at the back make their way in front, could you please kindly, those who are seated over there, please. Then we can leave the back seats for those who are coming in slowly, all right? But I would want us to connect, because the next segment is a conversation, and it will be lovely to see you nearer so that you can interact with the speakers. Okay. So good afternoon to you once again. Welcome back from lunch. And to kick off our afternoon session, we are going to have an interactive session, a chat on IFs and their approach to privacy in the African context. And at this juncture, I want to welcome our next two personalities that will
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Let's Talk. My name is Ixtel Mbaacha Dobgima, attorney and counselor at law, and today we are going to have a very interesting conversation about the role of the IFC, International Finance Corporation, in Africa in the context of data privacy. What are we talking about today? What is of major interest to us today? The IFC is a branch of the World Bank, and they hold a very interesting intersection between development and connecting investors to development in Africa. They have invested over $60 billion on the African continent. And while that is applaudable, we are interested to know what is their approach towards data privacy and the protection of personal data of the African persons or African citizens. And today our guest is none other than the Chief Data Privacy Officer of the IFC. I'll tell you a little bit about his background and why he is the best person to answer the questions that we have today about their data protection and privacy practices. So our guest here is Mr. Will Higginbotham, and he is a seasoned attorney. He leads the IFC's Global Data Privacy Office, which is responsible for advising IFC's 100 global offices, including 25 here present in Africa. He advises on privacy and personal data issues. Will was the lead author on the current World Bank personal data privacy policy adopted in 2018, as well as the IFC's privacy risk management policies and practices. In addition to leading the IFC's cross-functional data privacy office, he provides legal advice on broader data issues, including cybersecurity and data incident response. Welcome, Will. Happy to have you on set today.
No, thank you. I'm very happy to be here. And I'd like to thank Unwanted Witness and the Data Protection Office here, Mauritius, also for having me. I'm excited to take part. Absolutely.
You ready for the talk?
I'm ready.
Tell us a little bit about the work that the IFC does on a grander scale. Let's assume that there are people in the audience that are hearing for the first time what IFC is about: development, investment, connection, Africa. What is the work really about?
Sure, I can do that. And I think it's a question actually I get a lot, because oftentimes when I tell someone I work at the International Finance Corporation, or IFC, they kind of look and say, well, what is that? And I say, well, it's the private sector arm of the World Bank. And people say, okay, I understand what the World Bank is. And so the easiest way to think about it is the World Bank works with governments, lends and advises governments towards the goal of ending poverty on a livable planet. And what IFC does is we pursue those same goals and in the same countries, but we do that through investing, lending to, and advising private companies to help create jobs, increase shared prosperity, and things like that. And in the Africa context, you gave that $60 billion number, so that's a lot of investment. And if you look at just in the past fiscal year that's just ended for us, in that year alone, it was $11.5 billion US dollars that were invested in Africa across 40 countries. The focus areas are broad. We do a lot of lending to agribusiness because much of the life of agriculture is a huge driving force. We focus on, it's a young growing population, so a lot of, almost $2 billion of the dollars went towards entrepreneurship and focus on gender inclusivity, so women-owned businesses and helping that young growing population find jobs, keep jobs, get investment for their portfolios. And I think particularly relevant for this digital transformation, a lot of investment, again, nearly $2 billion in the last fiscal year towards telecom infrastructure. So things like broadband expansion, telecom towers, subsea and terrestrial fiber optic cables, connecting more people to the internet, expanding access to mobile internet and things like that. So a lot of investment in the private sector with the goal, again, creating jobs, creating a more open environment so young people who have that entrepreneurial spirit have access to funds and lending and those jobs to do that. And on the other side, we do a lot of advisory work, so over 275 different advisory projects across those same countries in the past year. And again, a lot of that is focused on gender issues and lending and making sure it gets to small, medium enterprises, it gets to that kind of environment. So helping larger banks understand how to reach out to a broader group of young companies and lend them money and really help grow economy in that way. So it's very much towards the World Bank Group's overall goals of ending poverty, but with the focus being the private sector, growing the private sector in all those areas, and that's what IFC is really focused on.
Thank you for that explanation. I think it's really great that you give us the context, because there's a tendency to think that the IFC is a philanthropist organization or that it gives aids or grants, but you're talking about investment for the purpose of development. And that is a good distinction that we should make as we're about to talk about data. Can you tell me what is the line drawn between the work that the IFC does and how personal data of persons comes into play? We would like to know the correlation so we can best understand what the IFC's role really in the protection of data comes in.
Sure. So I can definitely talk about that and about, when it comes to personal data and at IFC, and of course in my role as a Chief Data Privacy Officer, as the kind of internal advisor working with our teams on when we're processing personal data, when it's coming into us, when we're advising companies or entities in Africa, or we're collecting it for other purposes, is to make sure that we're using it obviously to an appropriate standard and how we treat it. And the way we do that at IFC is we have a single standard. Actually, I think it's an interesting concept that this crowd may be interested in, is that So IFC is an international organization. We're not, as you say, a philanthropist organization. We're an economic development organization, so we invest in the private sector. The goal is for those investments to be successful, and the ultimate goal really is then IFC exits and we crowd in the private sector. They come in, take those investments onto us, because ultimately that's what we're trying to do, is encourage more private sector investment in these countries. And on the privacy side, what we focus on is making sure we're following the principles of the World Bank Group's personal data privacy policy. That's really the guiding principle document that we use in all of our work at IFC. And just a little bit of a history of that I think would maybe be useful for this audience. So as an international organization, IFC is centrally governed by our member countries. We have 186 member countries. They all have representatives on our board of directors. And as opposed to operating under the particular jurisdictions or laws of each different country that we operate in, instead, they centrally set down our policies that we follow everywhere that we work around the world. So in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America. And in 2018, as you alluded to in the intro, we adopted this World Bank Group personal data privacy policy, and that is what we apply everywhere that we go. And when we developed that, it was very important that we looked at not just GDPR in Europe and some of those laws that are very prominent, but also what was APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperative, looking at. We looked at some of the different laws, the Malabo Convention and things in Africa that had data principles. We looked at laws in Argentina and other countries in Latin America and tried to distill them down to the core foundational principles that are really there in all privacy laws and regulations. Took that to our board, presented that to our 186 member countries and said, hey, this is the standard that we're looking to apply. Got their blessing, kind of saying, yes, this is what we think you should be doing. And so when we operate, wherever we're operating, it's always a framework based on those standards that we've been operationalized in our operations. And one very important piece of that is also we built in what we call a risk-based approach, because while we have those principles and the protection of personal data is of course of the utmost importance, we also have a very important development mandate. And that development mandate requires us to go into fragile and conflict states and to go places that may have no data protection regulation at all, or they may have a regulation but no enforcement mechanism or no data protection authority there to kind of put structure around that. So, having that risk-based approach to the balance, there's a need for economic growth in these countries. There's a need for development. There's a need for finance. Going into those difficult markets where they may lack some of those regulations, my office's job is to kind of take those central principles that we've decided are, the core principles we're going to follow, and make sure that our teams are respecting that and the privacy of the individuals we may be dealing with in those countries, but also that we're pursuing our development mandate so that it's not preventing us from doing a very important development work in a country because it may lack this, a certain law or regulation or be behind in some way in how it's implementing that. So we spend a lot of time with that balance. It's a very important part of our job in my office.
Let me play the devil's advocate here.
Okay.
So what is the incentive for the IFC to follow through and respect the personal data of citizens of a particular country where they are investing in a project? If they're coming in as an investor, there's financial gains for the IFC and its clients. What is the incentive there to ensure that they are respecting, protecting the personal data of citizens?
Sure, it's a good question. I mean, the first answer is it's the right thing to do, right? Of course, on that level. And on the second is, yes, we are an investment entity investing, and the goal is to do well and prove to the private sector that investment works. But, part of that is we're also a development institution. Our goals across the World Bank Group, working with governments, the private sector, everything, is to not just bring people out of poverty, but to improve their standard of living, increase that shared prosperity. And that means caring about more than just the bottom line of making money in the transaction, but also making sure that the communities that you're impacting are really benefiting from that. So it's not just this company that is doing well, it's the communities around that. So, there is a lot of work. For example, that's a major marker is, so just to take an agriculture project that we may do as an example. Yes, we may be investing in a coffee mill somewhere that is, designed to produce coffee, export it out, increase, make money that way and do that in that area. But we're also a development institution as well. And so there will be a lot of work that goes around going to the local farming community, finding those smallhold farmers that live in that area, going out, making sure that they're giving education on, here's how you can improve your coffee production. This is how you can make sure that your crops are harvested at the right time and get to the mill so that they can be processed, improving their livelihood by increasing their production, their productivity, those kind of things, helping their lives at the same time as the company itself is doing well. And in doing that, ultimately it's about that community around. That's ultimately what our goal is. We're development institutions, and so protecting their information, making sure that we're doing appropriate things with it, that we're not gathering it and using it for inappropriate purposes is very very important to the IFC, because the ultimate goal is helping those communities. That's ultimately you do the economic investment to increase the prosperity of all the individuals there. Does that answer your question?
It does, and leads me on to the next question, of course. Happy to hear that the IFC, the World Bank, has its own standards, especially for where a country does not have laws or a framework. And so those are those standards that bind your practices towards data protection and privacy. Can you touch a bit about what that standard is in terms of what types of data you collect? Do you disclose the use to the data subject? Do the data subjects have the right to request a deletion? What is that standard? If you can give us an oversight, would love to know.
Okay, sure, absolutely. And so kind of a few pieces there. I think I can take the last piece first about data subject requests and things like that. We have our own internal mechanism set up. So if someone wants to make a request of IFC about the information we have, you can go to our website, ifc.org, or contact us through the mail, or we have various different ways, and you can do a request, and we have a process for handling those internal to IFC. So yes, you can make a request just like you could to a company under a data protection law. As far as how we make sure these standards are applied in different projects or things that we work, it's kind of, I think I look at it as sort of on 3 levels of our expectations. And again, as a data privacy officer, I'm really mainly concerned, my purview is our processing. So data coming in, data going out, what we're doing internally is what we're looking at. So for example, when we're working with partners and clients and they're transferring, they need to provide us personal data in the course of the project because of the advisory work that we're doing, or even just the KYC information we need to know in an investment. We kind of have a 2-tiered expectation that we ask of them. So one would be comply with the data protection regulations that apply to you in your jurisdiction. And in many places that have more sophisticated laws, or even larger companies that have a more multi-jurisdictional approach, they'll be applying a standard. Even if they're operating in one country, they have a standard that they've set based on their home country or something like that. And that gets us a part of the way there. But we have a kind of a 2-tiered approach. The second tier is then really a series of things that we put in our contractual requirements, or things that are this very specific kind of basic privacy requirements that if there's no regulation covering it, here's what our expectations are of you. And these are, of course, things like data minimization, appropriate consent or permission to provide information with IFC for the purpose of the transaction, that you can securely transfer that information to us, that the information will be right-sized to the transaction. And so we spell those out very easily. And then we're also ready to step in if a client says, well, I don't understand how I would do this, or I don't have the capacity to securely transfer that data. How can you help me? So we do a lot of interventions with our project teams when they come to us and say, the client is confused about how they could, what they need to do here, how can we help them do that? And we do a lot of work kind of working with the constraints that some of our clients have, and particularly in more fragile conflict states, whether they don't have, many resources to have a data protection officer or, an IT team, much less, or something like that. So sort of two tiers of, here's our baseline expectation, the regulations that you applied, and here are some kind of, in a very regulation neutral, plain language way, here are things that we expect you to do when you're transferring data and having a transaction for us. So that's kind of one piece on the client side. I think a second piece is with vendors or people we may be transferring data to. And there it's, since they're doing something on our behalf and we're entrusting them with data that we've had and we've collected for a particular purpose, it's a little bit more of a little bit deeper look into what they're doing. And so, for example, if you work for a company that wants to be a vendor for the World Bank Group entities of any kind, we have a very specific data protection annex that has, here's everything we expect you to do. And even before that, in the vendor process, we have some risk management questionnaires that target, do you have, if you're processing personal data on our behalf, or you will be in this process, basically, do you have a data protection officer? Questions about their retention policies, things like that. A much deeper dive into what they have and what our requirements would be, because we're going to be entrusting information that we've gathered from a source and making sure it's being used for that particular purpose. So those are kind of the two areas when we are relying on someone else to do it. Now, and then of course, there's the direct collection, which we do in many cases. So I think I alluded to this a little bit earlier, but a lot of our results measurement type of work. So making sure that our investments and our projects and the advice we give is actually having that positive impact on the community, means going out and talking to the community. And so when we're directly interfacing with the community, we help our business teams make sure that if they're obtaining consent or if they're going out and collecting information from, say, a rural farmer in Ethiopia, that they're doing that in language that's appropriate, culturally, and for the level of sophistication of the audience, that is translated the right way, that we have a process for how we're going to make sure it's conveyed and convincing is collected if someone is illiterate, so they aren't going to be able to just read and sign and be recorded. So how are we going to go about doing that process? How we will set up community meetings to explain this if it's kind of more of if the culture is more of a community culture where that's in a more appropriate way to be conveying that information. And so there we have a little bit more control. We're getting it directly, also making sure that we're being very fair and transparent. We do a lot of work with our business teams to make sure they're doing that when they're collecting that information.
Well, thank you very much for sharing that. A lot of African countries are now enacting their laws in data protection and privacy. They're setting up the regulators' offices in different parts, different countries, Mauritius, Kenya, Tanzania, Ghana, a lot of these countries. What has the IFC done to hold conversations with the regulators in all of these countries as a good faith effort to show that even though the IFC has its own standards, they're ready to have a secondary party make sure that they're actually holding on to those? Is that anything that's happening now or in the future to come?
Sure. So, we try to have conversations, events like this, or going to places and with the regulators and the private sector in the companies that we operate. We also, of course, as a whole World Bank group, the bank in particular deals directly with regulators and governments very often, and we're all kind of one greater group there. So that's one of the lanes that we go through communicating. And I would say that it's very important. We understand that with the way we're centrally governed and kind of that sort of central model and the privileges and immunities and that issue that goes around that comes with a very big responsibility. So it's only through being a market player and following what is kind of the expectations for how you're going to protect and use data that we're entitled to those privileges. And we're very careful, not to say, okay, this is something we can take advantage of and we can go out and do what we want because we're an international organization. That's certainly not the way we think about it. We are very careful to pay very close attention to what's going on in the world. What are the developments? What are the expectations that are growing from expectations from civil society, from the private sector to do that, and making sure that we're evolving along with them, that we're keeping up with those standards, particularly because we're working with the private sector. They have expectations, and when these regulations apply to them, my most frequent conversation is going to be with clients and partners saying, explain to me how does privacy work at IFC? What are you doing? I need to feel comfortable with what this looks like for you as well. So it's a two-way conversation, and we understand kind of the privileged position that we're in. So we do a lot of work just to make sure that we're really keeping up with the international standards and being responsible citizens, for sure.
Thank you. The IFC has 25 offices in Africa. Can you talk about the trends that you have noticed in your job and your work as the data officer, chief data privacy officer? What trends have you seen across Africa in our privacy space?
Sure. So I think, a positive trend is that I get more and more questions from Africa, which I take as from our teams in Africa, who are getting it from clients in Africa, which I take as a really good sign. It's easy to track where new regulations or things are popping up in the world, because then I start hearing from our teams in those countries, because it's getting in the news there, and the clients are starting to put things into what their requirements are, and starting to ask our teams about that. So certainly we are seeing more of that in Africa. So you're seeing that the awareness, I think, is growing, at least in certain markets. So that's a very good sign. I do think that there's a lot of work going on across the World Bank Group, but in IFC in particular, to grow access to internet, broadband, things like that. And as people become more internet connected, there are more and more questions, but there's obviously still a long way to go in Africa. So one of the interesting things we get a lot of questions about are, the client needs to give us a set of information, and they just don't have the internet connection to do it. They don't have the bandwidth to upload documents or to do things like that. So we're seeing that awareness and excitement, but the questions are still on that kind of early stage, like, how do I get this data set to IFC when I don't have a reliable internet connection and things like that? So, we're coming up with a lot of creative solutions of, it could be someone from an IFC office driving there with a encrypted hard drive and uploading the information, taking it back to the office, putting into the system, as opposed to uploading it to a shared folder or something like that. A lot of questions around, data collection from rural communities. How do we convey what we're doing in a way that'll really make sense and be transparent for a community where people are not computer savvy? That's very fair to say, and understanding who is IFC, what are you doing here, why you're gathering information, how is that connected to my farm, what I'm doing here, and the selling to this particular coffee mill or whoever it is. And so a lot of the work is there's more awareness around it, but a lot of the questions are still kind of at that basic level of how do we do this securely? How do we convey this information appropriately to the community that we're working with?
And to recenter the conversation, we're talking about the IFC's role in investing in private projects in Africa. And those private projects are usually towards the development of Africa, correct?
Yes, exactly.
So what is the extent of the due diligence that goes on even after the IFC has completed its mission and handed over to the private actors who go on? Do you continue to oversee that their practices are compliant with data privacy laws? Or at what point does your due diligence end?
Sure. So one answer for that is, and this is kind of a legalistic answer too, is that in my office, since we're the internal privacy kind of regulator, our advisor for IFC, our main focus is how IFC is processing data, when data is leaving, when data is coming back to us. And so, it's really the main focus of what we're doing is how is IFC processing it, how we make sure that if it leaves us, we place a lot of requirements on it, right? Like you can use it for this purpose only. When it's no longer needed, you'll delete it and do things like that. So that's kind of the not as fun answer. The purview is really how IFC protects information or not. As far as what the client is doing with information and things like that. So that depends a lot in different sectors and different, where it is. Is it a financial institution? Is it an agribusiness company? Is it an infrastructure company? And the kind of due diligence that goes into that and how we track how they're handling that can be different situations, and it's actually usually run by a slightly different team, whereas I will help them on general risk appetite, privacy posture, what we're looking for and things like that. But since I'm on the inside of IFC, kind of advising us on what we need to do and not do, I don't look at particular projects on the other side where we'd be advising this way, and then could there be a conflict kind of between the two sides? So I know it's not a very fun answer, but that's the case there. But the question of once we've left a project and we're no longer involved, I mean, that's a question that comes up in a lot of areas, and it can be difficult, right? Because once you've exited an investment or once you're no longer there, your leverage to influence what a company's doing when you no longer have that relationship can certainly be limited. And part of the solution to that is a broader thing that we work with the bank group as a whole, of making sure there's that culture, the regulatory environment is there, and the implementation and that culture of implementing these rules is strong in the country, so that when you don't have a direct influence, you have hopefully created an environment with an indirect influence that helps people stay on the right path, even if you're not directly involved.
So I have two more questions for Will, and then we'll open up the floor for anybody who has a question. We have about 2 or 3 questions in the interest of time. So if you have a question, you'll just raise your hand and the MC will give you a mic and you can ask the question. Will, what will you, if you can, give us a hypothetical? I know you cannot give us exact facts and statistics, but what is a good project in terms of a good business idea, one which the IFC will naturally come in as an investor, but because of a data privacy risk that cannot be mitigated, it decides not to? If you can just paint that picture for us to really understand what are some of those kinds of instances.
Okay, so the question is a project that we wouldn't...
A project that you will. It's a good business idea. You would invest if all things being equal, but you do not because of a data privacy issue. There's something about this private individual or entity that does not sit well with your data privacy policies, and for that reason, you do not invest. Okay, no, hypothetical.
No, that's a good question. And what would be the hypothetical? And again, I would go back to kind of as the internal advisor. I'm often not on that side, right, of making those decisions about what is the client doing in this environment. I'm more on how is IFC handling it, how are we doing the back and forth and in that. I think that obviously if the client's doing something that's completely, we have to, if you're investing in a client that you want to be able to grow and scale and do something, and they're doing something that would not fly under the commonly held, like our privacy policy principles, which are the same principles that you find in almost every data privacy law, then you shouldn't invest in something like that, because it's not scalable, it's not going anywhere, it's not treating people's data appropriately. I think actually really things like that are quite obvious probably from the beginning, and so they probably don't even get very far. So it's not often that I even receive questions on something that's just that far out that would happen. But so I can't really think of even a specific example that I could generalize where that's happened. And luckily, our teams are very good about weeding out things like that. And if they have a question or something they're worried about, they hopefully would come to me, but that doesn't happen very often. So
Okay. We cannot end this interview without talking about breach notifications. If there's ever a breach with one of the projects that you have invested in, what is the requirement for the project owners to report either to their regulators or to you? And what does the IFC do when there's a reported breach?
Sure, okay. So if a client has, so taking the case, for example, of our vendors or those that we do business with, they have very strict requirements on how they have to report that to us. There are certain time limits. Of course, there are a lot of requirements that we ask them to put in place that would prevent a breach, hopefully, in the first place. But if they do have that, then they are required to report that to us within a certain period of time. They would flow through our data incident response process and procedure that we have in place. We have a team ready to spring into action. We have guidance on all the things from when do we notify, who do we notify, going through that. So it would trigger that process. There is a requirement that they notify us, and we would kick it through that way. Does that answer your question?
It does. Now, and how do you notify the subject if they're in a rural area, for example? Just curious, how would you notify?
Yeah, so it's frankly a very difficult thing to do. If you have that information, and in many cases, it would be relying on the client or the partner, the vendor, to do that, because they would be the ones that have the direct connection, the community to be able to do that. Of course, if you don't have a way to contact someone, it makes it very, very hard to notify them of a breach. But typically, that would be a breach that's occurring at the client level. So, the responsibility would be to them to have to learn to figure out how to do that and to get that notification in place.
Just by this conversation, we can tell that there are still a lot of gaps in areas that we're growing in, we being Africa. What is your recommendation, especially to a room full of privacy professionals, on where you envision that we should go in our data protection and privacy laws and practices and frameworks?
Well, I think that, there's a lot of development going on, and what's important is just to continue not only having laws, but having regulatory frameworks in place so that there are data protection authorities, there are consequences for not following the law, and there's also a forum you can go to so that companies understand what the rules are and they understand what they need to do. I think that data privacy is something that, we're all people, we all have personal data, we all want our data to be treated appropriately, and if people know the rules and kind of understand what the guide rails are, I think they're willing to, more often than not, willing to follow them. But for young companies, small companies, things like that, they need a lot of guidance. They don't know what to do, and that can lead to problems. So having that regulatory framework continuing developing, having that guidance coming out, and the more consistent that guidance can be, or the regulation can be between countries and jurisdictions, so you kind of say, this is what the expectation is, this is how the rules that we play by, no matter where we're operating and what we're doing, the more people understand those rules, and the easier it is to kind of have that consistency across. So I think really, continuing developing those frameworks, hopefully having it kind of coalesce over some standards that, I think in privacy, that's more or less happening around at least the core principles, but getting those frameworks in place, having regulators there that kind of are telling you, here are the rules, here's what we're looking for, having forums where people can go and say, I'm a startup, what do I need to know, and being able to get that advice, because you don't know what you don't know, and it may be for just lack of knowledge more than lack of wanting to follow the rules. So making sure those forums are always available is important.
Advice well taken. Do we have any questions from the audience? If your hand is raised, I can't see from here.
That's all right.
Any questions? Going once? Twice? All right, thank you so much,
off
Will.
the
This
seat.
was a great conversation. We have learned a lot, and thank you so much for your time.
Great, thank you. Thanks for having me. Thank you.
Let's chat. That it was either all understood or not understood. So where do we fall? Can I hear you? Where do we fall? Or we are still reflecting? Still reflecting? I don't hear you. We are still reflecting. Okay, fair enough. So as we continue to reflect, we have next a panel discussion, and the discussions will be around privacy and investigative journalism. So that is where we are going to have our next discussions on. And to take us through this segment, we have a round of panel members, and which will be moderated by Ms. Gaia. So ladies and gentlemen, the panel members and the moderator, Ms. Gaia, you're welcome on stage. Just walk to the panel, don't worry. Just to check to see if you've switched. Enjoy.
I need to get that sound bite because I would like to swap out my alarm for that, because that would be the perfect way to wake up every morning. So thank you so much. It's an absolute pleasure for me to be able to facilitate another session at the Privacy Symposium today. And it will be on the topic of investigative journalism and considerations around privacy. Perhaps this topic has never been more pertinent and more important for us to have conversations around, given that we are living out an age of disinformation and disinformation economies that truly benefit different companies and different actors. The role of journalists, the role of investigative journalism has never been more central. But at the same time, there are several questions around what that means for privacy. What are those holy lines that we should not cross? To help us sort of unpack the legal, ethical, societal, and other dimensional questions around this interaction between investigative journalism and questions around privacy, we're joined by a fantastic panel of people, journalists who've really been at the front and center of many things that have helped us not only get to the bottom of the truth, but also really leverage what they've been able to find to hold power and powerful actors accountable. So first, I would like, it's an absolute pleasure for me to introduce Mr. Jean-Luc Muthuswamy, who is a journalist from Mauritius, but is currently in Switzerland, who's been covering important issues around conflict. We are to be joined by Arif, who should probably be here in a minute. But also we're joined by Anne Boya-Donat online, who's the former program manager at the Council of Europe. We're also joined by Gabriel Geiger, who's an investigative journalist, David Hundine, who's the founder of West Africa Week, Sonia Smith, again online, who's an investigative journalist and a correspondent at AP, Adam Oxford, who's a freelance journalist from South Africa, Datasya Naidu, an investigative journalist from South Africa, Tapelo Nunlovu, freelance journalist from Botswana, and our colleague Arif should join us momentarily, and once he's here, I would introduce him too. So let me get to the panel and help us have this conversation around privacy. Thank you. Let me first check, Ms. Anne, are you able to hear us online?
Yes, I do hear you well. And do you hear me and you see me?
I hear you at the moment, and I'm sure I'm going to see you in a second too. So let me actually come to you first. Given your experience with the Media and Information Society division, how has your years of advocacy around privacy and investigative journalism, how has that informed your analysis around what are the critical developments when it comes to investigative journalism and privacy? How do you suppose we can, as societies, prepare for these challenges?
Well, thank you very much for this question, and thank you for having me in this panel, which I'm sure will be very interesting. Well, I've worked 16 years in the Media and Information Society department in the Council of Europe, and out of these 16 years, I spent 11 years dealing with all questions on data protection, freedom of information and freedom of expression, Article 10 of the European Convention of Human Rights. And then I shifted to Article 8, the right to privacy and personal data protection. And what rapidly became clear to me, and very important, is the enabling role of the right to privacy. Of course, it's a human right in itself, as it promotes and protects human dignity. But I found very interesting to see how it's a right that facilitates the realization of other rights. And indeed, how can we exercise a right to freedom of information, for instance, if what the processing of personal data reveals makes it possible for governments or for others to prevent us from exercising this right? It applies also to other rights. And on that subject, I listened to the panel on surveillance yesterday, and Dr. Boucher gave a very interesting example. So even if it doesn't seem obvious, I do think that protecting privacy is in many ways also enabling information and protecting the right to information. And of course, that would deserve to be developed much more, but we don't have much time. Yeah, you asked also what critical developments I would see, didn't you?
Yes, what you see as ways by which we could possibly prepare to deal with these challenges.
Mm-hmm. I would say prepare is already a bit late. Say prepare, but also react, and the faster the better. But I will start with the challenges. First, I would say, well, there are many, but unfortunately, I have to choose just, a few of them, and I try to pick up the ones I think are really important. First of all, I would say the uncontrolled, but also over-controlled use of technologies. And of course, when I say technologies, I mean the way technologies are used and the intentions behind, as of course technologies, and we all know, bring a lot of advantages. But I think we'll all agree that Twitter, for instance, was a very different media before Elon Musk. While intruding in private life and processing personal data is done more and more in sophisticated ways, and in a way that most people don't even imagine. And when technology are not controlled, we witness the spreading of fake news, of manipulated information to very, very narrowly targeted segments of population. And this has considerable risks, including for democracy. And I'm sure you all remember the Cambridge Analytica story and the impact it had on several elections and votes. Unfortunately, it hasn't disappeared with Cambridge Analytica, quite the contrary. Just think of the troll factories that are spreading disinformation everywhere, and unfortunately, very much in Africa. They don't only interfere in voting processes, but they undermine real, serious, and honest journalistic work. And notably by spreading lies under the cover of investigation, and thereby that jeopardize the credibility of real journalism and information. And of course, now the emergence of artificial intelligence increases that phenomenon. But on the other hand, when technologies are over-controlled, well, they open the door to mass surveillance with obvious effects on freedom of information. And the panel, again, of yesterday widely addressed this crucial issue. Well, many debates are still taking place and have been taking place for years on how to find the right balance between total freedom and the necessary but respectful control and regulation. And this is very, very difficult. The European Union has tried something, and we'll see how it applies and if it's successful, but we'll need a few years for that. The second issue I'm thinking of is more down to earth, maybe, but it's economical, or rather, it's the economic translation of the modern media and information landscape. When journalists are under the pressure of having to produce as fast as possible the most spectacular buzz to beat the competition, there's a real risk and a real threat to ethical practice. And it's not the journalists themselves that are to blame in that context, because they themselves suffer the economical pressure. And of course, they have to bear the pressure of artificial intelligence nowadays. Now, how can our society prepare for these challenges? As I said earlier, is more react than prepare, but also prepare on the long run. I would say by working in different but interlinked directions at the same time. Legislation, on the one hand, to protect the individual's privacy, and on the other hand, to protect the right to inform and those who carry the responsibility to inform. This should be done preferably in internationally converging efforts, because the harm done is done across borders. And nowhere, no country can claim nowadays to be free from anything coming from abroad, good or bad. But legislation cannot and should not go without principles and ethics. And it is, I'm sure it's also what is behind this symposium, those 3 days. And more than ever, in the context of the current developments that the symposium addresses these 3 days, we must all stand firm on human rights and ethical principles. And there I'm not sure about the idea of ethics being different from place to place, but this will take us astray today. Standing firm on principles applies to all actors, be it governments, be it the judiciary, be it business, be it media organizations, media professionals, and of course, the public at large. The current texts protecting personal data and privacy refer a lot to laws allowing processes, and I quote, one provided by laws. But it is also important to make sure that the said laws comply with ethics. The world, and Africa in particular, has suffered enough of laws that were not ethical. And to speak frankly, I'm not sure it's the end of it, considering the current influences and powers that are at work at the moment. Finally, I'd say literacy. This point goes hand in hand with principles. There we go back to the basics, to foster the acquisition and maintenance of the knowledge to decode information, identify manipulation, check sources, be critical, you name it, and of all the principles to be respected. This should start as early as childhood It's an endless endeavor that requires relentless efforts, resources, and patience. I'm really conscious of that. Strong literacy will not only enlighten individuals, but also contribute to the indispensable bottom-up approach calling for legal protection and influencing the legislative developments I was also calling for just a few minutes ago. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Anne. Thank you for that comprehensive intervention. Perhaps we can take some of those points that you put forward and dig a little bit deeper. But let me first introduce our colleague, Arif Suleru, who's the CEO of La Centennial, and we'll come back to you in just a bit to find out your experiences around this. Let me go to you first, Jean-Luc Mutuswamy. This topic is perhaps really close to you, right? Given your decades of experience covering conflict all over Africa, and given what we are witnessing today, the humanitarian crisis we are witnessing today, how can we strike that balance between delivering information but protecting the privacy of individuals in conflict? Generally, how do we balance between public interest and privacy?
In itself, and thank you very much for having me here, in itself, I could say it's a kind of conflict inside newsrooms, because these are the questions that we usually ask ourselves. The line is very fine. It depends on the context. It depends on the audience. It depends on the editorial line. It depends on what you want to bring in and what's your definition of public interest. I've worked, as you said, in many places, and most of the time these conflict areas, these are places where there's a huge expectation vis-à-vis journalists, maybe because there's a lack of trust of local authorities, in all those who say they represent the people, and they expect journalists to bring in justice, while it's not our job. Our job is to put forward facts and let the judiciary, all institutions take over. So there's a tendency from journalists, perhaps, to think that they are entitled to go beyond that line. So there is this expectation from journalists to go and tell everything about those who are public figures. And then I think that the decision to be made depends on what's being said in the editorial meetings of newsrooms. This is the place where I think journalists learn. It's the editorial meeting. So you bring in these elements and we say, what do we decide? There's one fundamental thing that we need to understand for us journalists, and that I try to say to my colleagues, is that it's part of the principles of journalism. There's that charter, the Munich Charter of 1971, which tells us that we have 10 responsibilities and 5 rights. Most of the time, journalists tend to think about their 5 rights, but there are 10 responsibilities. And the 5th one, I noted it because I want to say it as it is: be obliged to respect the privacy of individuals. Now, a public figure has a right to privacy, but it's true that if you build your career on who you are, and let's say you are the perfect person for the job, to hold office, and then it's not saying the truth by having another kind of life, then if the whole picture is about you, then this line becomes a little bit more blur. But when it's someone who is holding an office because he's someone who's been, maybe he's responsible, he's a professional, then he's entitled totally to his privacy, private life. So it's quite difficult. Now you mentioned this element of conflict also. Today, more and more on our screens, on our telephone, on the TV screens, we see lots of victims, of people who are suffering from wars, from conflicts. And this is one question that we try to discuss every day in the newsrooms that I've accompanied. And it's true that a newsroom which is based in Paris or based in Washington, and which is covering, I was in Sudan covering the Darfur conflict, for example, in the early 2000s. Of course, you can bring in elements from far, but when you're in-house, in the country itself, it's more difficult, and it's a more difficult decision to make because you're a member of, let's say, the same family. So what we try to do each time is to think of the way we're showing victims. I was working in Bangui in the Central African Republic in one radio station which is extremely trusted still now. And in the morning, sometimes we would see people come in with dead bodies because they didn't trust the authorities. Let's say these people were killed by gunmen in uniform. We don't say military people because we don't know if they may have stolen the uniform. We don't use the word terrorists, for example. We say armed groups because someone who is considered as a terrorist by one group is considered as a savior by another. So if you want to be careful in what we say. So they came to us. Why? Because they trusted us and they wanted us to talk about this. And we said to them, you're angry, you're sad, you're grieving. We thank you for your trust, but we're not going to show that to our audience or to the world because when something bad happens, it goes viral. Because we need to respect dead people, their families. Dead people also have rights. So this element of privacy goes well beyond. Most of the time we think about, let's say, the head of state doing something, and so journalists should be able to investigate. Investigative reporting, I won't say investigative journalism because for me journalism is what we're doing, and reporting, maybe it's another area where we have time to investigate, should be able to draw that line. And maybe another element I'd like to bring in is the agenda of sources, because our work as investigative, as journalists, I would say, just as journalists, is to work from elements we get from sources, as many independent sources as possible. But all sources have their own agendas. So when you get something, you need to be able to discern, and this discernment doesn't come like this. It comes from discussions, and it brings me again to this editorial meeting. When you put on the table to your editor-in-chief, who should be experienced, who should have this experience, you tell him, well, this is what I have, and other colleagues will help in the discussion. So it's, I would say, this distinction and this discernment is a collective work, and it's not just about one individual.
Thank you. That was extremely informative and, of course, heartbreaking, no doubt. Gabriel, are you able to hear us? Yeah? Because I can see you.
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes. Gabriel, building off that, could you talk to us about what is it that you follow in terms of times when you're reporting on issues relating to surveillance, technologies, especially when you're dealing with vulnerable groups, right? What is it that you propose as good practices so that privacy can be ensured?
Sure, and just to say it's a pleasure to be here with this really great group of panelists. I'm an investigative journalist specializing in issues around surveillance, technology, and artificial intelligence. And I work at Lighthouse Reports, and we're an investigative newsroom that partners with different media brands across the world to collaborative investigations. So that's ranged from like The Guardian in the UK to Africa Uncensored and The Continent. Of course, we come across sensitive data all the time. That can be data about the targets of our investigation, so an oligarch or the head of a surveillance company, but it can be also the data of the victims of something we're investigating. And then it can also be leaked data as well. And of course, in leaked data, people people's personal data may end up in there without their consent, or they may not even be related to what you're investigating, but sort of end up in that leaked data set collaterally. As an investigative newsroom that's based in Europe, all the work that we do and all the personal data that we process as part of our work falls under Europe's General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, which lays out some pretty stringent requirements legally of how we're supposed to handle that data. But at the same time, this European Data Protection Regulation explicitly grants broad leeway and exemptions to journalistic projects, as long as the journalists can substantively argue that our project is within the public interest. So what's the consequence of this? Basically, for all our projects, we have to weigh the potential privacy infractions that may come about from our work against the public interest of what we're trying to do. And that makes it a sort of slippery ethical gray zone that we oftentimes have to navigate. And I would say specifically when it comes to stories about surveillance or technology, there's this sort of added paradox, if you will, that of course we're covering and investigating surveillance, invasions of people's personal life and privacy, but at the same time we risk maybe reproducing some of those same patterns if we aren't ethical and careful about the data that we're looking at. So more concretely, how does that weighing work internally within Lighthouse? We kind of have a few different principles that we follow. First of all, data should be kept securely. It should be used fairly and transparently and accurately. It should be used for a very specific purpose, used no more than necessary, and only kept for as long as necessary. So if we kind of think about two case studies and how this works out in practice, one would be an investigation that we did on oligarchs, Russian oligarchs, in the wake of the war in Ukraine. And this investigation involved analyzing social media data from some of these different oligarchs, so Instagram, Facebook, these sorts of things. And of course, that can contain sensitive information. So of course, we had to consult legal experts, data protection experts for this investigation, given how litigious some of these figures are. But in addition to that, we had to ask, what is that line? Can we firmly argue that this is within the public interest to use this data? And then, how do we make this specific and set certain guidelines? So, for example, we don't want to use any social media data that may have minors inside of them, so the children of some of these oligarchs. I think another example would be our work on predictive artificial intelligence systems that we investigated how these systems try to predict who should be investigated for potential crimes like committing fraud with Social Security benefits. And what we found when we started investigating these systems is that these systems are oftentimes very biased against certain groups. So, for example, biased against women, biased against people from a migration background, biased against parents. And in one such case, in one such investigation, we were investigating one of these systems, and the training data for the system, so all the personal data of people that had been investigated by the system, was leaked to us. And this training data contained really personal information about 12,000 people, so ranging from where they lived, information about their medical history and mental health. And so it was a huge task for us to think about how to use this in an ethical way in order to demonstrate that the system was biased and had wronged these people. So how do we break this down? First of all, using this only for a really specific purpose. So we want to test this algorithm AI system for discrimination against certain groups. And that's the only thing we want to use it for. Then no more than necessary. So first of all, we pseudo-anonymize the data, and then we only analyzed it in the aggregate. So we didn't look at individuals' data. We only looked at, okay, how many women are there in this data set versus how many men, how many people who live in this neighborhood versus this neighborhood. So we never saw individuals data. We were always looking at aggregated data. Data security, we kept it confined within one person's laptop. And implemented a logging system online. So essentially any actions on the data were logged. And then no longer than necessary, the data was immediately deleted after our investigation. And then sort of the most, I would say, tricky and most important part about this when dealing with vulnerable groups, especially, is using the data transparently and accurately. So for individuals where we did want to potentially look at their data, before doing that, we reached out to them and received their consent to do that. We took them through the reporting stages and transparently explained how and why we were doing what we were doing. And through this sort of informed consent, this dialogue, we wanted to give victims the opportunities to also be stakeholders in the reporting process, or to decline participating if that's what they ultimately decided. So I think to sort of conclude this, I would say oftentimes legally our backs are quite covered and we're quite sort of particular about that. But where the trickiness comes in is oftentimes this more gray ethical considerations. And that's where it takes, I think, the most care. And I think, as the previous panelists noted, something that always has to be examined within the specific context of an investigation, the specific material, and the specific publication and editorial objectives.
Thank you. Thanks, Gabriel. I was wondering if we could maybe draw David in. David, are you able to hear us? David, is your audio working? While we try to get David in, perhaps can I come to you for a moment, Arif? Because what I'd like to really discuss is the question of public authorities, right? Given your position, given your experience, how do you recommend that journalists and others, people on social media, how should people deal with sensitive information relating to public figures? Where are the ethical boundaries when it comes to that?
Let's hope it is working.
No.
It is not.
No.
So I will
Let me try.
do something here. No. Yes. No? Yes.
Can you try?
Can we try?
Yes.
So we can.
Yes, thank you very much. And as Jean-Luc said, thank you for inviting us. Few clarification. I am not a journalist.
CEO.
I am the CEO of a leading media company in Mauritius. We have newspapers, magazines, directories, and a number of publications, very big. In our case, we have had many high-profile cases leading to very senior officials having to submit their resignation after a few investigations that were carried out by our journalists. I cannot name names, but when I say very senior officials, I think Jean-Luc knows some of them. We start always by training our journalists to hold on to their, what we call code de deontologie, which is like a code of conduct, code of practice, in where we define everything that they are allowed to do, their responsibilities, what they have to do, their rights also as journalists, and then, but mainly the responsibilities. And in there will be definition on a few areas, important areas about privacy, about what you call public officials, about where you can go, how you check your information, how you make sure that you have evidence that the information has been checked. Naturally, there is this, what we have to protect our sources. The editor-in-chief or somebody at higher level will always have, possibility of verifying, checking, etc. We have what we call panel of legal advisors to whom we go to before we come out with, let's say, something that would have a very high impact on, let's say, there are consequences. Investigative journalism lead to consequences, sometimes right ones, sometimes bad ones. So that's why we've been saying always, those people who are in the media, we know that there are positive investigations, there are negative investigations. Positive investigations, like actually in Mauritius, there is a sort of, let's say, a few reports, a few writings going about the health sector, food in the health sector, etc. So this is what we call positive investigative journalism. Then you have also negative, the ones that could lead to serious consequences, having very high level officials having to resign from their offices. So we will always sort of sit down and look at, is it really of public interest? In what way is it public interest? Let's sort of brainstorm of what is public interest in this case. Each case is analyzed on its individual merits. So let's say a high political person involved in a private party. So where is the public interest in this? So this is largely, lengthily discussed. Then legal advisors are contacted to get their what we call legal opinions, because most of the time cases like this will go to court, and in most cases the court will have to determine where is the limit for privacy and where is the limit for what we call public interest. So that's why we sort of try to take maximum precaution. The training goes through the code de déontologie, code of practice and the professional responsibilities. But I think on a general note, because when I was coming to this conference on privacy, I saw a contribution from somebody. I'll just share it with you. Somebody called Lord Paul Brew, who is the chair of the Committee on Standards in Public Life. He sort of said, he recommended to the authorities, he called it the 7 principles. He said, if the 7 principles are observed, then there will be less conflict between what we call private life and public interest. He talked about selflessness. So people in public officials should practice selflessness, should have high sense of integrity, should be objective in their decision making, in everything that they do, everything that they say. Accountability, that people should be held accountable for their decisions and whatever they do. Openness, honesty, and leadership. So Lord Paul Pugh was the chair of this committee who made these recommendations. If public officials are aware of these 7 principles, then they know that when you hold a public office, these are the good things you should do, and stay in that.
Thank you. David, I'm going to check if you're able to fix your audio yet, or are you still having challenges? All right. Sonia, are you online? Are you able to connect? No. All right, let's come back to David and Sonia when they are able to fix their connectivity. But perhaps we can move to another area of discussion very quickly, which is, all right, given that this is the understanding, these are the challenges, what is it that we could do to promote collaboration, promote capacity building? Adam, can I come to you first? And given sort of your experience with training and tools for data-driven investigation, what do you see as good practices, as ways of educating fellow journalists on ethical considerations when you're dealing with personal information?
Hi, guys. Thank you very much for inviting me along. So just a little bit of background to me for people who here. I'm based in Johannesburg in South Africa, and I'm a freelance media consultant. I work with a lot of news organizations across the continent, and particularly down here in Southern Africa, on training for data-driven storytelling. So by that, we're looking at things like acquisition of data, cleaning data, analysis, and visualization of data. So we do work with a lot of investigative newsrooms, both large and small, and I would say that unfortunately my experience of how well these issues are handled behind the scenes is not great. I think there are some very, very good investigative journalists here, some very, very good investigative newsrooms who are very sensitive to international best practices and laws like GDPR and the restrictions that they bring. But quite typically what I see is after a training on data-driven journalism, we'll offer a few days of support for trainees where people can ask us questions about data sets they're working on for stories. They can ask us to help out with some of those functions, cleaning and analysis and so on, helping them get into the habits of, or helping them with spreadsheet formula and things like that. And that requires collaboration on spreadsheets, tools like Google Sheets or Microsoft Excel. And, the first thing that happens is that we get invited to share data that includes bank statements, that includes employment records with salary numbers, ID numbers. We get payroll registries, and it's not all coming from leaked data either. I mean, this is data that also is coming from things like freedom of information requests, PIA requests here in South Africa. Government departments are responding to PIA requests and giving out spreadsheets with personally identifiable data in them. And what I see, the way I kind of see newsrooms reacting is that as a rule, they're quite good when it comes to data governance on publication. So a lot of the issues that we've been talking about here, removing minors from stories, being sensitive about people's, about not publishing personal information in their actual stories is good, and people are sensitive to that. But there's not really a lot of consideration to what's happening in the back end with sharing this data, where it's stored and how it's being passed around. I get spreadsheets that are emailed to me, sent via WhatsApp, shared on Google Sheets, which are relatively secure. But I've never once been asked to delete data after I've worked on it with somebody, for example. So even if I was totally comfortable with working on the data that's been shared with me, I don't think I've ever been asked by a newsroom to remove myself from a Google spreadsheet or delete data that had personal information there. And I think this is a real challenge. I mean, your question is, what can I do to address this in my training? We certainly touch on privacy in training. I think it's quite challenging because it's not a subject that gets talked a lot about in newsrooms, and the discussion around newsroom culture has come up a couple of times in this session. I think that's very important. There's not a lot of support from senior editors around the subject, particularly where they're sending a junior to a data training, but they don't really, the senior editors don't really have a good grasp of how to handle big data spreadsheets themselves and what they might contain and so on. So I think newsroom culture comes into it. In terms of our trainings, we talk about privacy, we talk about removing personal data, we talk about sharing files securely. And the problem is that it's because it's wrapped up in the rest of the training, and the primary reason for people being there is around data-driven storytelling. I think it's very hard to kind of expect people to go away with a really good grasp of what it means to be very responsible when it comes to data governance and back end of an investigation. At the same time, it's a separate issue which really needs to be invested in by newsrooms. And I genuinely don't think they're doing that, certainly not in this region. I would say, that there are a lot of reasons for that. Generally speaking, privacy is not a big issue, despite it being, a cornerstone of local constitutions and things like that. Most reporting, certainly here in South Africa, is very happy to overlook issues of privacy when it comes to dealing with issues of security, for example. In Johannesburg, where I live, we have the networked NPR cameras everywhere with facial recognition, behavioral trait recognition, things like that. That seems a good thing because, for most citizens, for most readers, and then for most journalists as well, they're quite happy to sacrifice a lot of the privacy entitlements because there are bigger problems living in high crime areas, living in areas where government has essentially failed and the private sector is moving in and not really adhering to the privacy rules because they know they're never going to get caught out or never going to get investigated for them. So I think it's difficult. To answer your question directly, what do we do to educate journalists through the training we offer? Or through the training we offer, we try, but there is a much broader and much deeper issue that has to be addressed. And to be honest, I don't think we're really talking about it in newsrooms from the perspective of privacy. We talk about it from the point of view of cybersecurity. We talk about it from the point of view of what happens on publication. Just finally to kind of round up, even there was a big case in South Africa around a group of journalists who went to constitutional courts because their right to privacy had been infringed because their mobile phones have been phone communications have been intercepted by the state security agencies and so on. But even within that context, where it was a big story about surveillance of journalists, I don't think that conversation was really extended to the right to privacy on behalf of other citizens and so on. It was really focused on the needs for journalists to operate in a secure environment and security of sources and so on.
Thank you, Adam. Let me quickly bring in Latasia and then Nlovu, Tapelo, following each other. So I can also kind of hint to you that your questions will follow next. So please think about what it is that you'd like to ask the panelists. But Latasia, let me come to you first. We discussed quite a bit about covering issues relating to public authorities, especially in situations where information is quite controlled and the tensions involved between powerful actors and information you want to share. What is it that we could do to improve the culture of knowledge sharing and collaboration within the field of journalism?
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for having me on this prestigious panel. I think what we must remember first and foremost is that investigative journalism plays such a key role in keeping democracy strong, in holding power accountable, and in ensuring that society is more just. And with regard to that, the ethics that exist and coexist around journalism seem to go hand in hand. But I think from a perspective within South Africa and the investigative journalism space here, how do we begin to foster a culture of knowledge sharing and collaboration within this community when it's still such a specialized field? And there's almost a sense of gatekeeping within certain institutions when it comes to the sharing of information, of contacts, or from being able to learn from each other and collaborate. And I think it's such an important tool in any investigative journalist arsenal or toolkit to be able to collaborate with people within this very specialized field, to be motivated to just strengthen. They speak about strength in numbers and resources when there's collaboration. But I feel that within an African context, we're not really exploring the possibilities of such to the point where there is that collaborative effort, where there are opportunities to delve deeper and not just provide surface level coverage when it comes to holding government figures to account, into maintaining transparency, And I think it's really sad, especially from a context within an agency that I work for in South Africa, in that outlets here seem to be very territorial almost of what they investigate. And there isn't really a willingness to dig deeper, to invest more time in investigations, but rather to get stories out there and to have a sense of prestige in terms of preserving what people, investigative journalists are able to discover and uncover in their investigative techniques. So I think from a perspective of working within the investigative journalism realm in South Africa and on the continent, I think there needs to be much more willingness to have that collaboration, a willingness to be able to think out of the box, to shun traditional methods of research and investigation, and to be able to just foster this culture of knowledge sharing and collaboration within a community that's so specialized, but also so important in terms of transparency, in terms of accountability, and in terms of holding public figures to account.
Thank you, Latasia. Thanks a lot for that. Let me go to Tapelo very quickly to ask about another form of collaboration, which is partnerships between journalists, between media organizations, international bodies, and civil society. Tapelo, what is it that you would recommend as ways for better collaboration to prioritize privacy rights? Are you able to hear us, Tapelo? Okay. I know he's online, so
Hello,
maybe
sir.
what we could do is, yes.
Am I
Yes, go
online?
ahead.
Am I audible now?
Yes,
Am I?
yes.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you very much, and greetings to all fellow panelists and organizers and those who are listening or watching. I'm a journalist, yes, and media consultant. Maybe what I wanted to emphasize before going to your specific question is that I was also part of, I'm a co-founder and trustee of an organization called the Inc. Center for Investigative Journalism. The main purpose of establishing such an organization actually answers your question that collaboration sometimes can be bettered by coming up with non-commercial and non-government efforts or means, whereby you know that your aim or your target is just a non-profit. It is only in the interest of the public interest. So I think if we can also go that way in terms of collaboration, either locally or nationally, regionally or internationally, we will be able to touch the nerve where it is needed, because then there wouldn't be accusations of being out for profit or accusations of being biased, especially commercially, but also maybe politically, because then people who fund you don't expect anything but for you to protect the public interest. I think we need to remember that investigative journalism, sometimes you will call it a watchdog journalism, accountability journalism, or you can also say undercover journalism, and that brings in connotations of doing something that is out of normal from the normal journalism, in that now so some of the ethics that are well known, you still practice them, but there is a risk of actually going overboard and tolerating some things that are not allowed by ethics. For example, when you go undercover, you actually are being deceitful because you are not coming up front with your identity. So I don't think the normal journalism would allow that up front. But it's something special to investigative journalism because it is believed that what you are looking for is in the end or ultimately in the public interest. And I think maybe we can argue as to what is public interest and so on, and how do you define it. But generally, it should be easy to define when we look at the issues. Now, a case that is where actually rulings by judges emphasizing that journalism is a special kind of operation, especially investigative one. I remember the recent one of Moti in South Africa, Moti and Amabungani Investigative Center for Investigative Journalism, where the judge actually made a suggestion that even if you are requested to go to court in order to ask you to intercept or to listen to someone's communication, you must be able to tell the judge if that someone is a journalist. By so doing, the judge will be able to decide whether he should give you the permission or not. Because journalism, when you now go out and then you use sources like someone has said earlier on, and those sources you have actually given an oath to protect, be accessed willy-nilly. That means that kind of those sources are exposed, and that will defeat public interest because in future you won't get leaks from the public or whistleblowing from the public. So I think in terms of I think I've covered a little of your question in terms of collaboration, but the whole idea was to maybe go back to the basics and find out really why we do investigative journalism, the importance of it, and what does the public benefit from it. And because of that, then it is obvious that things like collaboration are very important and vital. We have organizations, international organizations, that some of national organizations affiliated to. I think that kind of affiliation is a form of collaboration that need to be cultivated further. I can go on and on. I'm not sure if I'm beyond your time.
Thank you. Thanks, Sapelo. Let me quickly make space for maybe one or at most a couple of questions. Is there anything that anyone would like to ask? No? No. Thank you. I know we've gone over time and it was a slightly longer, but I mean, we had no panelists, so I guess it's justified in some ways. But thank you so much. This was an absolute honor to have been able to speak to the wealth of knowledge that was there in this panel. Thank you so much and hope we have an easier life, all of us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
To help you. Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, Ladies and gentlemen, our next segment as we wind down today's events as part of the 5th Privacy Symposium 2023 is a presentation of a research paper. As part of the activities planned for the symposium, we had a call for papers on policy and data rights. And it is my pleasure to introduce to you the winner of that paper, which was entitled The Ethics of Data Use in Media, Exploring Informed Consent and Data Ownership. And Afrofeminist Data Governance in Africa. The owner, the author of this paper that was won by Policy and My Data Rights Africa is based in Kenya, and she will be joining us online to make this presentation. Please join me in welcoming Miss Mwara Chinchanga.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me.
So, hello, Myra.
Hello, hi, how are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Thank you for joining us at the symposium right now that is ongoing. And congratulations to you once again. So without wasting, yes. So without wasting any time, I would want to hand over to you to quickly give us a brief of the paper, and thereafter we will get into a Q&A. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here. So just allow me to share my screen so that I'm able to present. It seems like I'm not able to.
Continue, we hear you. Just.
Okay, are you able to see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Right, my name is Mara Gishanga. I am a program lead for My Data Rights Africa. And in collaboration with Policy, my colleague Rachel Magenge, we came up with this paper, which is called The Ethics of Data Use in Media, Exploring Informed Consent, Data Ownership, and taking on an Afro-feminist data governance approach in responding to this issue. So a little about Policy and My Data Rights. Policy is an award-winning Afro-feminist civic technology collective. Policy's work and research spans across the use of implementation of data and technology to engineer social change. And in the recent past, Policy have researched ways through which Africans can take back control of their data and reimagine new ways of tech ownership. And then a little about My Data Rights. My Data Rights is a feminist curation project on understanding how data is framed within the African context, specifically in relation to AI, privacy, and data protection. My Data Rights was a subset developed after a Mozilla Foundation fellowship, and it seeks to be led and empower women and collaborate with African feminists to contextualize the experiences of data collection, processing, use, and the overall purpose of shaping policy and discourse in the implementation of data protection and privacy. And before I get into the research paper itself, I think it's important to know where it is anchored from and where it's stemming from. And so I'm glad to introduce the Afrofeminist Data Governance Project. This is a project that is a collaboration again with Policy and My Data Rights that has birthed this paper and birthed other products of research and resources, this being one of them. And so it seeks to promote a more equitable and just governance, data governance practices within the African context by co-creating data-driven solutions with various stakeholders, including government, civil society, organizations, researchers, and regional bodies. Specifically, the project seeks to use the knowledge and expertise of African women and other marginalized groups to inform the development of data governance frameworks that are more inclusive and equitable. And so with that background, it sort of informs the shaping of this research. And so I'm quickly going to do a background and introduction of why this paper, why we set out to investigate this paper, and why it is important for us in the recommendations that we're giving, which is an Afrofeminist data governance approach. And so this research paper investigates the ethical considerations surrounding the collection, use, and sharing of of data by individuals, by media organizations. It specifically highlights the issues of informed consent, data ownership, and their interlink within the Afrofeminist data governance. And so the research objectives were framed and anchored on setting out to investigate the informed consent practices in African media organizations, examining data ownership and its implications on user rights, exploring Afrofeminist principles in shaping these ethical data practices, and then providing recommendations for media organizations in Africa. And so our methodology is rooted on very much explanatory. We took on an explanatory approach to the investigation. We reviewed qualitative and primary data analysis, and also looked at existing literature and existing data research that had been available. And so what did we found as some of the challenges of informed consent, data ownership and control? So I'm just going to highlight for the challenges and practices of informed consent, and then I'll urge you to engage more on the research paper when it comes to data ownership and control. And so some of the challenges that we highlighted are anonymity, identification, data aggregation, and secondary data. And then some of the recommendations or good data practices we recommended included transparency, anonymization, aggregation, public interest justification, and then opt-in and opt-out mechanisms. And so just to quickly touch on the importance just to touch on like why these challenges and why these practices. And so as we know, a lot of the journalism that is shaped right now is driven by data, and oftentimes it can be challenging to ensure there's complete anonymity in handling large data sets. And so even with the removal of personal identifiable information, there is a risk of re-identification through data leakages or interference techniques. Another challenge was with aggregation. Similarly, journalists often rely, as we know, on aggregating data from various sources to provide comprehensive insights. And sometimes it can be very difficult within the aggregation process to obtain informed consent, especially for individuals whose data is included in large data sets or public data sets like government records or public sets. And so it provides a challenge in identifying and seeking out these individuals and these subjects to, get their consent. And then, of course, with secondary use of data, which is similarly with aggregation, it's that even when journalists want to repurpose data that has been originally collected, it's so difficult to find these individuals and then get their consent again. And so some of like the good practices that we identified and hope to build upon and engage more collaborative to build more on these practices, because we haven't captured the full extent of them, include transparency, anonymization and aggregation, public interest justification, and again, the opt-in and opt-out mechanism. I recognize I have only 10 minutes for this presentation, so I'm just gonna get to the cream of the cake as why we wanted to recommend an Afrofeminist lens to data governance. And so for ethical considerations, it's important for us to recognize this gender data and to understand what gender data is so that we can understand why we're recommending an Afrofeminist lens to data governance. And so just for context, gender data in the African continent remains frighteningly understudied and underutilized. It is often enveloped as a general scope of data, just everyone's data. And I think it's important for us to reflect because there was a prior research that was conducted by Policy and My Data Rights that identified that there was a lack of inaccessible gender data collection, its use, the protection of it, and this is very scary to me because this forms and is counted as a basis of policy making as well as resource allocation. But then why do we consider gender data? because data, honestly, is collected, processed, and interpreted under very unequal power relations, often rooted in very systemic bias, patriarchy, colonization, power, cultural and social norms. And it really, these gender relations manifest in data practices, especially in how this data is generated, analyzed, and also interpreted. And so it is therefore very important for us to identify these gaps of bias and how the factors I mentioned earlier intersect to discriminate and further marginalize those underrepresented and further authored in this data. So finally, why? Why do we take on an Afrofeminist data lens? Why is that important for us? And why does this seek to respond to these challenges of informed consent and data ownership and control? An Afrofeminist lens seeks to review ethical data use in media by bringing a unique and fresh perspective to consider intersectionality within gender, ethnicity, and other social factors. It's important for us to factor in that for us, these social factors have to be captured within the African context and the African lived-in experiences and realities. And so considerations from the Afrofeminist standpoint comes to ethical data in media really looks at examining intersectionality of Afrofeminism and recognize that individuals' experiences, oppression and privilege based on intersecting identities and gender, class and sexuality and more is really a huge factor to look at and oftentimes is dismissed or overlooked. So when collecting data and its use in the media, it is essential to acknowledge and address these intersections to avoid reinforcing and further reinforcing stereotypes and erasing the diverse experiences of African women and marginalized communities. Inclusivity and representation, which are very anchored in the Afrofeminist lens of data governance, really ensures that we ensure that data collection methods capture the voices, perspectives, and experiences of marginalized groups who have been, historically underrepresented or silenced. Contextual understanding is also important, and an Afrofeminist lens to data governance takes on that approach because it's paramount to emphasize the importance of understanding the specific social, cultural, and historical contexts within Africa. And so data collection and analysis has to take on that approach because there has to be sensitivity to local cultural norms, values, and power dynamics. It is furthermore crucial to avoid imposing Western frameworks or assumptions that may not accurately represent the realities of the African communities. I'm not going to, there's a little bit more about that, but I'm just going to finally share that an Afrofeminist lens on ethical data use in media seeks to challenge power imbalances, amplify marginalized voices, and promote a more inclusive and equitable media landscape within Africa. It really calls for a critical examination of data practices, the methodology of how this data is reviewed, the ethical implications of data use, and to ensure that data serves as a tool of empowerment, representation, and social justice. So what are we recommending? Quickly. I'm sorry, have I run out of time? Hello, can you hear me?
We hear you.
Okay. So finally, with our recommendations, what are we recommending? An intersectional approach to examining the complex dynamics of gender, race, and other intersecting identities within the ethics of data use in media. We are also recommending developing and further adopting an Afrofeminist data governance framework that acts as a guide to address or respond to specific ethical concerns of data use in the African media. We're also recommending policy for media organizations, regulatory bodies, as well as policymakers to promote ethical data use within the African media landscape. Engaging in collaborative partnership is really important with media organizations, civil society groups, and researchers working within the field of media ethics and gender studies. And then finally, community engagement and capacity building through organizing workshops, training sessions, and community dialogues is so important, so that it's not that this work is done in silo and is just a resource that's left outside, but then it also trickles down in its applicability and its implementation. And so community engagement and capacity building is really important, and having community dialogues to engage with groups such as media professions, journalists, and community members. Thank you very much. Our call to action is to engage more on the research, because there's a lot more in the research paper itself. And so how you do that is through our digital platforms, which include our website, as well as our Twitter, our X, and LinkedIn pages. But I also recognize that the Privacy Symposium will also host it on their platform. So thank you very much again for the opportunity to also present at the Privacy Symposium. It's been a privilege and an honor. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mara, for that insightful paper. Indeed, when it comes to gender and the vulnerabilities that come with the gender perspectives, they cannot be underrated. And I like the fact that at the end of the day, it is to ensure that we have inclusivity, but as well as ensuring that there is no one left behind. At this juncture, I just want to quickly open it up to the audience. If there are any questions for Mara, this is the time. Going once, going twice. Okay, thank you. So Mara, there's a question for you.
Just an observation, really. So, this view is on, the Afro-feminism approach of data protection, all of that. So, would you agree that this is particularly to the African Symposium privacy, but it relates to the entire world, because you have different continents with different types of prejudices, gender biases, and in India, as we've seen recently, the transgender having their own issues. And how do we say that? Thank you for highlighting this position, and that this position should be the trending factor leading to all these gender-related issues, these biases all across the world. Do you concur with me? Yes. And taking that into consideration, we also take into all the other identities that are now emerging and relating to the empathy aspect of us being into AI, into data collection, being more inclusive of all those people. Yeah, this was only a contribution that I wanted to make. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Do we have any other comments? Mara, do you want to say anything in regard to the comment?
Yes, I just want to iterate, yes. It's very important for us to ensure that in every shape or form, we're capturing the realities of often not captured voices and perspectives. And I think even as we look at feminism, it feels like, yes, we can borrow some of the principles, yes, we can borrow some of the experiences, but African women also live very different experiences outside the collective women of the world. So I think ensuring that we're almost centering in the perspectives and the realities of these people within the communities that we are a part of, because there has to be a genuinity and a contextual understanding, I think is very important. Thank you.
Thank you, Mara. Do we have any other questions, comments from the audience? Going once, going twice. Okay. So Mara, thank you so much for joining us online, and thank you so much for that paper. Once again, congratulations. And this is the starting point, and I hope we can have the paper engagement on other social platforms. It will be interesting to see reflections and perspectives, and obviously to inform future programming around interventions on breaches, and even informing legislation and as well as policies that are endangered going forward. So thank you so much, Mara. It's a bye from our end, and I will now continue with my audience. Thank you. So ladies and gentlemen, as we crown our day, this was the last activity for the day. And I just want to thank you for, once again, first of all, I want to thank you for being a very good audience. Thank you for your participation, the enthusiasm, and the questions, comments that have been coming in that are giving us more inspiration and more food for us to reflect on as we continue engaging in this industry. I want to quickly highlight our program for tomorrow. So tomorrow will be our last day, and we'll be ending the symposium. And part of tomorrow's activities, we will begin with our master classes as well. So I encourage you to please come in early. Let's start with our master classes that will be around media and law. And then we will then reconvene into the main session, where we will continue with some panel discussions to continue the discussion and crown the day later. So once again, thank you so much. Please clap for yourselves. You've been very good. And you're welcome to leave at leisure. Thank you.
Your steps keep me away.